hear the name Nicolas Refn, your mind probably goes to Drive, or to the man who does those really cool poses on the red carpet. Thinking immediately of Drive and Refn is understandable. I mean, the sharp neon-infused cinematography, Gosling's scorpion jacket, and Carey Mulligan's fervent stares. I get it. It was a masterpiece. But what a lot of people may not know is that if it weren't for Refn's Pusher Trilogy, which he made early on in his career, Drive may not even exist as we know it. Okay, it maybe could have, but as I'll be discussing in this video, the Pusher Trilogy was only created to help Refn get out of a massive debt. After it was completed, it really solidified and elevated Refn's status in the film industry and helped him evolve as a filmmaker. He even said himself that he wouldn't be here today without it. In my opinion, this trilogy is sublime and might even be my favorite trilogy ever created. It's an incredibly realistic deep dive into the Copenhagen crime world. Each film focuses on a different character who is a part of the same gangster ecosystem as they try to survive in the harsh and unforgiving world they are a part of. In this video, I'm going to explore how the trilogy came to be and why it is such a compelling and convincing work of art. We have to start at the beginning and go all the way back to the 90s, to Nicolas Refn's roots. At age 24, he made his first feature film, Pusher. It was also Mads Mikkelson's film debut, and my god, look at our Mads now. Danish film was really only put on the map in the 90s by Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg's Dogme 95 manifesto, and Pusher was no doubt influenced by Dogme. Pusher is shot in cinema verite style. Refn only used handheld cameras, which elevates the stark realism captured in the films. Refn's father was actually editing Lars von Trier's Breaking the Waves while Pusher was being edited. Crazy. The 90s were a big year for crime movies. There was Goodfellas, Casino, of course Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, and many more. Pusher was born out of this era and was considered the first real Danish crime film to ever exist. Pusher follows Frank, played by Kim Bodnia, who is a street-level drug dealer who seems to be living a pretty okay life next to his sidekick, Tony. Enter Mads Mikkelson and his beautiful, beautiful respect tattoo on the back of his head. After Frank makes a last-minute decision to make a huge deal with a former inmate, the deal goes sour when he's intercepted by police. Frank manages to dump the ridiculous amount of dope into a nearby lake at the end of his unsuccessful getaway run, so he avoided prison, but without the drugs or the money he was going to make on the deal, he finds himself in major debt. Enter the very hospitable, yet equally terrifying drug lord, Milo, played by Zlatko Buric, the man Frank is indebted to. From here on out, the film follows Frank's chaotic life over 1 week as he scrambles to try and make the money he owes Milo. Out of desperation, he screws people over, has violent outbursts. He even throws a cardboard box at this random person on a bike. Just horrible behavior. I want to try and think of a better phrase, like, it's like a train wreck, you can't look away. But I'm really struggling to be creative right now, and that's all I can come up with. So anyway, Pusher came out of Refn's love for gangster films, but he said that about halfway through shooting it, he realized he didn't want it to just be another movie about crime, but more about the vulnerabilities of people. As Refn puts it, Pusher is almost like two different films. The first half is action-oriented, and the second half becomes more about Frank's emotional downfall. I do want to explore Refn's portrayal of crime in this trilogy a little bit more, so I'll be getting to that in just a bit. For a debut film, I think it was phenomenal. Some have noted that it is a bit amateur from a technical standpoint. There are some poorly lit scenes, and you can see him try out what has come to be his signature neon style. And it's of course not as polished as his more recent films, but I mean, he was working within Danish union rules, which only allows 8 hours of filming a day and no filming on weekends. So with the time and budget constraints, plus the fact that Refn is in fact colorblind and cannot see mid-tones, I think it was just fine. In my opinion, the camera work alone really signified the potential Refn had as a director. The camera often follows Frank from behind as he makes his way through Copenhagen, and as the viewer, it's so immersive. You feel like you're right there with Frank. You're a part of his crew. The camera often rapidly pans back and forth between characters without cuts, showing their real-time reactions during a conversation or as a situation plays out. The camera work really heightens the experience for the viewer. It forces you into the uncomfortable, intense situations. You literally feel the sweat, grime, grittiness, and aggression through your whole body. This came to be a significant style that Refn would return to in the following following Pusher films. Alright, so Pusher was released in 1996. It was picked up in the UK and took off from there, which garnered Refn and the actors widespread acclaim. His next film was Bleeder. It was released in 1997 and starred all three actors from Pusher, Mads, Kim Bodnia, and Zlatko Buric. Refn was looking real good, and then he made Fear X in 2003. It was his first English language production, and unfortunately it tanked at the box offices. Audiences just didn't understand Refn's work yet, you know? The commercial failure of Fear X left him in over $1 million of debt with his production company. Refn never intended on going back to Pusher. He actually resented the idea of returning to it out of a fear that he couldn't make a better movie. But he soon realized that the only way to quickly come up with that kind of money would be to create something with international appeal and something that he could finance. He needed to revisit it with the goal of it being both commercially and artistically successful. Out of sheer desperation and being so pressured for money, he wrote Pusher 2 with Blood on My Hands in the span of 2 weeks to a month from his recollection, and Pusher 3, I'm the Angel of Death, in 1 week. The money he raised for the 2 more Pusher films is actually shown in the documentary Gambler, directed by Fee and Bob. Refn said, "It forced me to understand that film is a commodity, that you have to look at it as a business, and that sometimes you have to let go of your pure artistic integrity and combine the two things, business and integrity, into its own art form, rather than only concentrate on one or the other." I actually really appreciate his honesty with this. I think it's something a lot of artists grapple with, trying to produce authentic art, but with the intent on it making money. It's like you have to sacrifice a bit of yourself and your practice in order to make appealing art for others, or something like that. Refn continued and said, "I wouldn't be sitting here if we hadn't done it. It needed a different approach, and I think that came out of television and my love for TV, especially The Sopranos. Pusher 2 and 3 were conceived like a television series, but instead of making it for TV, I made them as features." As Refn said, the trilogy needed a different approach, and the most important thing for him was that each story was different from the others. What followed is probably one of the most inventive trilogies I've ever seen, so let's dive into the next two. So 8 years later, Pusher 2, with Blood on My Hands, was released in 2004. Mads Mikkelson returns as Tony, remember the guy with the respect tattoo? But this time as the lead protagonist. It takes place sometime in the future from the previous film. Tony gets out of jail and owes a debt, surprise, surprise, and visits his father, better known as the Duke, at his car shop, which you quickly realize is a shady operation that fits somewhere within the Copenhagen crime world. Tony and his father have a poor relationship. You come to get the feeling the Duke is quite ashamed of him, sees him as a failure, and doesn't really want him around. The film centers around Tony's deep-seated need to win the approval and love of his father. Tony decides to join an old friend to make quick cash, but of course, things go south, and like in the first Pusher, there's a second drug dump. I repeat, a second drug dump, and the whole thing gets real complicated from there. In the first Pusher, we witness Frank's vulnerability and how he tries to mask his emotions, but it focuses more on his impulsive choices and destructive behavior. Refn gives us more of a poignant character study in Pusher 2. Tony is a pitiful character. He can't seem to find where he fits in, he keeps screwing up, and is constantly being reminded by others about how horrible he is. But after he finds out he is a father, something seems to shift within him. There's one scene in particular that is, in my opinion, the most important of the film. Tony is at his friend's wedding reception. The scene takes place just after he hears his father's speech, which has low-level digs at him, and he's watching his father, who is with his younger son from another woman, as the maybe 6 or 7-year-old and his dad watch a stripper perform. Tony seems to be identifying with the son and is even maybe experiencing a flashback from what his own childhood looked like. You come to realize that Tony was born into this world and grew up in this, for a lack of a better word, toxic environment. He didn't have a choice, and maybe he never really belonged. It is in this moment that Tony realizes he does not want his new son growing up like he did. And it's this realization that influences his behaviors and decisions as the film goes on from here. Tony's character arc could have very well been influenced by Refn's personal life. Refn stated, "Having a child made me a much better director. Everything in my life had changed. I understood that what I was making was not about me. It was about the process of creating. You have to cut the tie to your own ego." He goes on to explore this father-son dynamic in Drive Drive too. Refn's style really started to take form here. His camera work exceeded the first films. There are some incredibly long takes with quick camera pan movements interspersed throughout that were just so engrossing. The camera is always circling around the protagonist and physically moves in closer to the character, heightening the intensity of the situation. You really begin to notice that Refn isn't interested in showing the world outside of what the protagonist and other characters see. You're only ever witnessing the events at street level. You're in the griminess of the streets, right next to the brutal violence and drugs. Refn also returned to the iconic character intros and use of underground heavy metal music, and in a few scenes, you hear him use a synth score, which becomes an iconic staple in his later work. Pusher 3, I Am the Angel of Death, was released in 2005 and introduces the new protagonist, the drug lord Milo, who we met in the first and briefly saw in the second. Zlatko Burek is actually the only character who appears in all three of the Pusher films. Pusher 3 takes place over the span of one long day. It's Milo's daughter's 25th birthday party, and he promised to cook for over 40 people. While juggling the stress of cooking, he's also dealing with the logistics of his drug dealing business. He receives a shipment of ecstasy instead of heroin, and after he gives his crew food poisoning, another dude, Muhammad, has to do the deal alone. Everything once again becomes a hot mess. Muhammad goes MIA, there's no drugs or money, and for the first time we see Milo as the one in hot water with a dealer. As a consequence, Milo is coerced into hosting the new drug lord's heinous dealings at his personal restaurant. Like Tony and Pusher 2, we really get to see the vulnerable side of Milo. The very first scene of the film is Milo attending a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. Throughout the film, he grapples with the idea of relapsing and using. This intrapsychic storm is explored so well through Refn's direction and style. There's a scene where Milo is given drugs and you feel like you're in his head, dealing with the internal pressure of choosing to use or not. In the first two Pusher movies, we see Milo as the top dog in the Copenhagen crime world. He was always the guy who held the most power and stature. But Pusher 3 shows us that he's getting old, and there's a new generation of younger drug lords who want to be the kings of Copenhagen. The Pusher Trilogy marked the beginning of Nicolas winding Refn exploring what came to be the main story focus in his future films. A male anti-hero of some sort who is navigating his way through the risky circumstances that come along with being a part of the criminal underworld. Refn said himself, "I've always liked characters that because of the circumstances have to transform themselves, and in the end, it's inevitable that what they end up becoming is what they were meant to be." The characters that inhabit Pusher can often be horrible, abusive, and cruel, but the film's intention isn't to portray them as good or evil, they just exist and we're bearing witness to it. Refn explores the perils of balancing stoicism and brutal aggression. Each character is quickly stripped of any sort of idea they once had of themselves, or withheld from others. In the second half of Pusher 1, Frank's tough exterior deteriorates when he's faced with the impending possibility of his death. In the later two movies, Refn provides us with a theme the protagonist will have to come to terms with as the film progresses. The first scene in Pusher 2 opens with Tony in jail, with a cellmate who is giving him a lesson on being tough, basically showing others not to mess with him. This is something that he currently lacks and struggles to find throughout the film. And as mentioned previously, Pusher 3 opens with Milo attending an NA meeting, and his struggles with addiction haunt him throughout. All the protagonists are insecure. Frank's unable to deal with his emotions, Tony's dad issues coupled with his inability to fit in, and Milo having difficulty accepting being under another person's reign, and also his refusal to be called a junkie. Refn really explores addiction in Milo's chapter. However, it is worth mentioning that both Tony and Frank also struggle with addiction and are using all throughout the films. Despite the heavy-handed, extremely unpleasant situations we bear witness to, there are bits of humor and humanity that are worth mentioning. In Pusher 1 and 3, Milo's horrible cooking is often referenced as the pit of others jokes. In Pusher 2, there's a scene where Tony and his friend are trying to figure out how to change a baby's diaper, and they go back and forth arguing on what animal is on the diaper and how to put it on properly. In Pusher 3, Milo gives a speech about his daughter that feels warm and familiar. These scenes stuck out for me because the films are littered with the male characters mainly talking about drugs, money, or sex, but small instances like these are scattered throughout the films, and I really think they show the honesty in Refn's writing. It reminds us that they are just people too. An interviewer once said to Refn, "It's easy to categorize these films as the European Godfather trilogy, but they do even less to glorify or advocate that lifestyle." Refn's response was, "That was very important to me. I have children, and I'm saddened sometimes at how the media can package a certain type of life because it can sell. It's false. When I made 2 and 3, and I had a lot of real gangsters playing in the films, I cemented my belief in that. These people all had a sadness. This was not a life that was ideal for anyone. It was a life they fell into." Refn's portrayal of the criminal world is far from glamorized, and he really refuses to give the audience any sort of romanticized version of being a gangster. All the characters are highly stressed out, always owing or being owed money, and are often on the brink of the next catastrophe that could owe them their life. In between these moments, they're often just waiting around in dingy places, waiting for the next thing to happen, and quite honestly seem very lonely. In Pusher 1, there's a scene where Frank is looking in the mirror, and you can see he has photos of famous film gangsters taped to the side of it. Frank aspires to be a version of these men. It's his fantasy, his idealized life that will soon come to realize he'll never be able to reach. As Refn mentioned, much of the cast of Pusher 2 and 3 were played by real gangsters, and the people at the NA meetings Milo attends in Pusher 3 are also real addicts. In another interview, Refn was asked, "In casting and working with criminals, did you see a growing self-awareness in them as the films progressed?" To which he responded with, "The people I was working with were the ones that already had that self-awareness and could look at their lives from outside or with a different point of view. But again, these films weren't made to judge them. They weren't made to judge anybody, and I don't make moral films. I'm not trying to push an agenda down anyone's throats. They're made much more in the sensibility of a voyeur, using the camera as an eye." Although each film is a standalone, upon rewatching, I noticed how many reoccurring characters there actually are throughout the trilogy. This is another one of Refn's nods to realism. Amongst the chaos and ever-revolving door of strangers, enemies, friends, and business partners, there's an interconnectedness that is very much reminiscent of the real world. When Milo appears briefly in Pusher 2, he mentions Frank to Tony, and Muhammad, Kirk, Jeanette, and of course, Refn are all characters that had previously appeared in the films. One of the most interesting characters to me in the trilogy is Refn. He first appeared in Pusher 1 as Milo's right-hand muscle who hassled Frank for the debt. There's a part where he actually confides in Frank, despite the circumstances therein, about how he has a dream of leaving the gangster world and how he wants to open his own restaurant. He appears in Pusher 3 when out of desperation Milo visits him to ask for help. As the viewer, you realize Refn did manage to leave the criminal world and open his restaurant. During the reunion, he tells Milo,
"Гуляй одиноко себе. Гуляй мене. Розумієш? Б'юся. За 20 годин. Я буду сречен чоловік. Але не можу я сапону кримінал врятувати. То завершено."
This really conveys the reality of the world they all inhabit. You'll never achieve real happiness while you're still in it. All 3 films share ambiguous endings. You don't really know what will happen to the characters after the film ends. Frank and Tony are on the run, and Milo knows he will have to deal with the consequences of his cover-up. The trilogy ends with Milo alone in his desolate backyard, looking at his empty pool. His run in the world he once knew is over. Frank was the middle-tier street-level dealer, Tony was scraping along the bottom as a wingman, and Milo was the top dog. Regardless of stature, no one can ever really survive forever. Everyone will always fall. In the drug trade, you have to depend on others to survive, but those you depend on you can't trust. Every character is a mere pawn to one another, reacting to a complicated system of events that are out of their own control. You have to accept the inevitability of something always going wrong, someone screwing you over, and ultimately, what seems to be never-ending fleeting moments of danger and brutal violence. I think this trilogy had a massive influence on the crime film world, and of course on Refn himself. I actually just watched Brother 1 and 2, the Russian crime films by Alexei Balabanov, and I can't help but wonder if he was influenced by Pusher. The Safdie brothers' Good Time is also quite reminiscent of these films in both the protagonist's characteristics and the rapid, often violent sequence of events that take place over a short time span. With all this said, this trilogy was such a feat for Nicolas Winding Refn. It's really cool to look back on these and see his very first experiments with neon lighting and dark synth scores, and although I appreciate his newer films, The roughness, realism, and honesty in these will forever hold a place in my heart. And although it must have sucked to be in that much debt, I'm really happy he was able to get out of it, and I'm really happy that these exist. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know in the comments below what you think about Nicolas winding Refn. Do you like his red carpet poses as much as me? Did you like this trilogy? Did you hate it? I would love to know. Thanks again for watching.